Welcome back to the Aussie Shed, ladies and gentlemen. Bit of a handy DIY for you here. What I'm about to show you is how to get a manifold flange plate extremely flat without using any expensive tools or needing a machine shop to do it for you, and yet still being able to get it to a point where it will be as flat as if it has been machined. Now, this flange plate was previously flattened on a large belt sander, and it has been welded into a turbo exhaust manifold for my DIY twin turbo project that I'm building at the moment. The flange plate, when it was welded, was bolted to a large aluminium heatsink / purging block and then bolted to a steel beam. It has still sustained a little bit of warpage. Initially, the flange plate wasn't completely flat to begin with. Pretty flat, but not completely flat. So now I'm at a point where I want to get this flange plate machine shop flat so that I can start setting it up on the engine. I have a particular technique that I use to do this, and it involves just using a handheld 4-inch grinder or a 5-inch grinder and a machinist's surface plate. Now, fortunately, I have a machinist surface plate here, and that's just used for spotting the flatness of the flange. But you can use anything that you know that has a known flat surface. I always find that stone benchtop offcuts, like granite benchtop offcuts and stuff, are extremely flat. Pieces of thick glass are extremely flat. Any of those things are flat enough that you can use to spot off something like an exhaust manifold, because your gasket will take up a certain amount of unevenness, but it has to be pretty flat. Things like large aluminium blocks. This is the purging plate that I used to weld this manifold on, and it in itself is extremely flat, way flatter than the manifold is. And I could actually even just use this as a spotting plate, and if I could duplicate the flatness of this onto this flange plate, it would be good enough to use on the engine. Fortunately, as I say, I do have a surface plate, so that isn't an issue for me. But for you guys out there that don't have a surface plate, there are alternatives. As long as you use the flattest thing possible, you'll generally find that they're all flatter than your flange plate is. So we'll just go over to the surface plate and we'll make a bit of a start on this. So this is my granite surface plate here, folks. Very flat, as you'd imagine. And all I'm using the spot with is just some cheap bearing glue from an engineering shop or an automotive store. So what I'll do now is I'm just going to roll out some bearing glue onto the surface plate. And the big trick with this is keeping it nice and thin, not putting too much on. So we'll get this rolled out. I'm just using a roller from a craft store. It's nothing particularly fancy or anything, but like I say, there is a bit of technique in rolling out the bearing glue. You have to get it really, really thin. If you don't get it thin, you'll end up with high spots just in the bearing glue that can throw off your spotting on the manifold flanges. So I'll just get this layer spread out and we will start into it. At the very start doing this, it's all on the rougher side, as in you're taking off large amounts. As the manifold flange plate gets flatter, you have to start becoming more and more precise with the processes that you're doing, which isn't really that hard to do. But I'll grab the manifold and we'll just spot it up for the first time, and I'll give you a bit of a look. So all we do is just grab our manifold and sit it on there, and straight away you can see that it's very easy to swing it in the center. It's actually pivoting off this area here and rotating around roughly around this one bolt hole here, and that could possibly be due to the weight of the manifold sitting towards the back, because it does rock slightly forwards and backwards. But the biggest area here is the left to right rock. So we know we've got a bit of both. We've got a bit of forward and back and a bit of left to right. So I imagine when we do spot this and pull this off, most of our initial work is going to be in the center, and that's where we're going to have the most marking by the bearing blue. So we'll just put a little bit of light pressure on this just to kind of sit it evenly, and we'll just move him around lightly and just see what we come up with. So let's see how we went. As I mentioned, folks, it's all going to be in the middle. This was the point where it was rocking around on. So this is where we have to start. If we had any spots on the end that would have been where it touched off when it was rocking, we just disregard those for the time being and just go for the bulky areas. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go over these areas here with the 4-inch grinder and just start working it until we start getting our marks spreading out. So I'll take this over to the other part of the bench and we'll just get into it. One of your biggest issues, folks, is going to be holding your manifold down, depending on the shape of it. Some are obviously a lot easier to hold down than others. It doesn't really have to be held that well because you're only working it lightly. You do still need the thing to be held down pretty well. You don't want it moving around while you're working on it. Now I can't work out how to hold it in my vise. I've tried a few different ways of holding it, but I haven't found anything that's successful. So just bear with me. I'm still kind of in the stages of trying to find something that's a position that's going to stop this from rocking. That's pretty good. Like I say, there's not a lot of force going onto it. So we'll just start it there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lightly touch these areas here with the 4-inch grinder, and then you'll see how we sort of start going from there. So bear with me, folks, and I'll sort of guide you through the technique. You can't be aggressive when you're doing this. It is only light touching. Even though we are right at the very start, we can be a little bit more aggressive, but even still, we still have to be kind to it, because you can actually end up really rooting yourself up here. So we'll have a bit of a start and we'll see where we go. So you can see what I've done there, folks. I've just taken that area where the bearing blue was and I've removed it lightly with the grinder. Now, this is basically a process called scraping that you use in engineering to straighten cast iron beds on lathes and all sorts of equipment and machinery. Except we're not using a scraper, we're using an angle grinder instead of a scraper, but it's the same process of spotting it and then removing the material. So basically it's a process of just continuing along with this. So I'll just get into it and I'll film all the different stages, and you'll see this shape change, and eventually the grinding will start jumping across onto these as well, and eventually we'll be just doing dots on all the surfaces. I know for a fact there's a low spot in both these corners from where the belt sander has taken too much off them. All we've got to do is get coverage for the gasket on these corners and we're good to go. But we have to get to a point where we are using the grinder on the whole surface, bar I think this very outside edge. So I'll keep spotting, keep grinding, you guys keep watching, and you'll see the pattern develop as we move along. Each time you go back to the surface plate, it's a good idea just to re-roll it, just because you've disturbed your layout by spotting the manifold on there. So you know, each time you do it, I'll work in sections. I've got enough here to do sort of 3 goes. I imagine we're going to have the same deal. It's going to continue working in this area until we get this down enough so that we can start to spread out. But you can see we've now got new marks, which we'll now take off with the grinder. I'm being a little bit aggressive here. I'm taking off more than where the blue is, just to sort of push me along a bit. I do have quite a bit of experience doing this. I suggest when you first start doing it, until you get a feel for it, only take off where the bearing blue is marked. Otherwise you may find you sort of take off too much, but we'll keep going and all will be revealed. Back to the plate again. Rather than re-roll it, I'll just use another section up here. As you see, folks, it's literally just rinse and repeat. Now, it's probably going to take, geez, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 passes of this to get this. There's already, even though it is still rocking around, there's already a lot less rock to it than there was when we first started. So even though it's not flat yet, it's certainly a lot flatter than it was. So yes, but I'll keep at it. I'll shut up now. You can just watch how this pattern develops on the whole thing, and as I say, when something substantial happens, I'll start talking again. Righto. So you can see this spot over here on this end section. I'm not addressing that at the moment. Until I start getting a spot over here, it's really just referencing that it's touching here, still touching through here, but not touching here, even when I sort of rock it on the surface plate. So we'll just leave that. That will be a point that we have to take off. It's obviously higher there than it is, say, for example, down here. Because a lot of the grinding's been done up here, which would coincide with that side. But for the moment, we'll just keep going at this, like I say, until we get a bit of a spot starting on this side, and then we'll do both of them. I'll take it over to the surface plate, and you'll see that it's rocking nowhere near as much as it was when we started. It's getting flatter, even though the surface isn't completely flat. It's only really the surface finish that we're going to be dealing with here at the end that's left by the angle grinder, not the overall flatness of the flange plate here or the manifold. Look, even cast iron exhaust manifolds, factory cast iron exhaust manifolds that are warped, you can apply the same process without having to take it to a machine shop to get it flattened properly. You can do it yourself at home using this process. I'll take it over to the surface plate and we'll have a bit of a look over there again. So I'll just roll over it again. I haven't put any more bearing blue on this from when we started. There's enough on here that you can just keep pushing it around and pushing quite hard with the roller when I do this, because it only needs to be very, very thin. You'd be surprised how little it takes to do this. So sitting it on there, you can see it doesn't swing as easily as it did before. It's still swinging roughly off that same position, but it's taking a lot more force to do it. And even though it's still rocking, the rock is greatly reduced. So once again, we'll mark it up and grind it off. There you see, there are spots. We'll knock those off and rinse and repeat. It's actually quite surprising how flat this is. You'd think it would be gouged with the grinder, but because we're only kissing it lightly and we know exactly where we have to touch it, we're not actually putting divots in it, we're just taking off highs. So it's surprisingly flat whilst you're working it. Anyway, I'll be back. Because we're starting to ride on this spot over here, you'll probably find that most of the spotting will be over probably this half of this center panel here as we work our way down to this area here. It'll probably taper across to nothing kind of thing, but the bulk of it you'll probably find will be here. I guess we'll get to see whether I can either see the future like Nostradamus or I'm just a plain old bullshitter. Anyway, I'll be back. Right folks, you can see we're starting to develop a bit of a spot on this corner now. So we've obviously got a high, and then a high up there. We'll just keep working on this little area down here at the moment, and then we'll start moving into these guys. So as you can see folks, there's only a little bit of light spotting coming up on this centerpiece here now, with our main areas being up here and over here. So what I think I'll do is I'll take these guys off, clean this off with some acetone, and then start working on these big spots as well. Obviously, folks, you can see what we're doing here. We're actually duplicating the face of the surface plate onto the face of this manifold flange by the use of a spotting compound, in this case bearing blue. So when we're finished, the face of this flange will be a replica of the face of the surface plate, which is completely flat, other than a slight texture that we've created from using the handheld grinder, which we'll be able to remove just by sanding or filing, but it will be dead flat. So far it's progressing quite nicely. Just keep watching, folks, it'll all start to unfold. Obviously, folks, doing this requires you have a little bit of hand skill with your little grinder. You want to make sure that you're hitting the spots that you want to with the grinder blade. If you need to practice on some bits of steel, you know, get some Sharpie and mark some spots and see how accurately you can hit those spots with your grinder without fucking up, because if you hit the wrong spots, you know, continually, you're just going to make divots and shit. You really need to have a reasonable level of accuracy while you're doing this. But it's not something that's beyond the ability of your average person, so we'll keep going. And the spotting compound does not lie, folks. If there's a mark there, you can be confident in taking it off. There are no false positives. So you can see what's happening, folks. As I mentioned right at the start, our pattern will start to spread out along all three from our center one, heading out until we get coverage over pretty much the entire thing. As long as we've got gasket coverage, we're good to go. And that's the point that we will then start working on the surface finish. Just something I haven't mentioned, folks, this is just a plain grinding wheel. It's not a flat wheel or anything like that. It's just a plain, well, this is a Bosch brand, probably came with a Bosch grinder, just a standard metal grinding wheel. You can see that the edge isn't square, it's sort of tapered down. That's just the result of me doing, you know, a bit of grinding work with it. When wheels are brand new and they have quite a square edge on the outside, they're probably a little bit awkward for doing this sort of stuff. So if you've got an older wheel, use it. Or if you've only got a new wheel, wear the outside edge down to a bit of a taper before you start doing this too. It'll just make it a lot easier to control, and you'll find it much easier to use. Another little tip too, folks, I'm using a battery grinder for this, as you can see. Just a shitty Ryobi battery grinder. The reason I'm using a battery grinder and not a mains powered little grinder is these things tend to run a little bit slower and they're a little bit aggressive than your mains powered 4 and 5 inch grinders. I also have a really high quality Bosch battery grinder, and it runs almost the speed of a mains powered grinder. So I tend to prefer to use this El Cheapo bloody Ryobi thing just because it runs slower, and I find it's a little easier to control for sort of fine detail work. So just another little handy tip there, folks. So this particular technique, folks, this is actually a family secret that's been handed down through the generations. If you'd have asked my father how to do this, he would have said to you, "I'll tell you, but I'm going to have to kill you." But because of the advent of YouTube, I'm showing you here, and you don't have to die to receive the info. How good's that? But you must use your newfound superpower only for good, not evil, folks. Not evil. You can guide this around a little bit too, folks. You can see here we're getting a lot more coverage on this area than we are on this area here. So if we keep going this way, we'll have this and this done and still have a section to do over here. So what I'll do now is I'll stop doing this piece and I'll just do this and this one over here just to kind of work it back down onto this side until this one on this end becomes a little bit more even with this guy over here. I'm just going to give the surface plate a bit of a clean, folks. It gets embedded, or not really embedded, but there ends up being quite a bit of swarf. Not sure if you can see it there, just sort of sitting in the bearing blue on the surface. And because I'm dragging this across the top of the surface plate, I really don't want to damage the surface plate in any way. And sort of start wearing into it, because that will change the flatness of the surface plate, obviously, which is not what we want to do. So we always have to look after our surface plate and keep cleaning it as you're doing things like this. Anything that's even mildly abrasive is going to affect your surface plate, so you have to be very careful and try to use the whole plate. And yeah, just be on the lookout for when you do start to get a bit of a build up. Just give it a bit of a clean off and start again. I think I'll give my roller a bit of a clean off too. It seems to have a few little bits and pieces of specks in it, so I'll give the roller a bit of a clean off, and we'll start fresh with everything. Alright, ready for a bit more bearing blue. So that's about how much you need, folks. Not a lot at all. If your layer is too thick, you won't spot accurately. It'll just put big blobs on everything. So when in doubt, go too thin. You'll be surprised how thin you can actually have it, and it will work absolutely fantastically. realistically, I probably have a bit too much on here, but I have a little bit of experience with this. Oops. So I know what to sort of look for and how to deal with it if I do have the layer a little bit too thick. But it's not too bad. Maybe a tad thick. I'll just keep an eye on it. See how it sort of, see how it spots up. I'll show you how this is going, folks, anyway. So none of that rock that we had initially is there now. It just sits completely flat on the surface plate. It's very hard for it to rotate. You can't just push it and have it sort of rotate. It will swing fairly well by the ends. You can obviously make it sort of swing around the middle, but it doesn't want to naturally do that by itself now. It has pretty much no rock to it, so it is very, very flat. So you can see that we have obviously come quite a long way compared to what we started with in terms of overall flatness. So you can imagine when this is finished, surface is cleaned up a bit, gasket on there, and you'll have no problem getting a good seal with all your manifold bolts, pulling it down, and yeah, it's going pretty good. So as I mentioned over there on the other part of the bench, I'm not working this area at the moment. I'm trying to get this down and get a bit more coverage with the bearing blue on this side, just so we don't end up in a position when we finish of having everything else done and then still needing this to do. So depending on where the highs and lows are in the plate that you're doing, just tend to kind of work those areas just to minimize the overall amount of work that you have to do on the flange plate. You'll obviously see that as it'll start to tell you the story as it unfolds itself. So yeah, let's keep getting into it. So you can see, folks, we've got a fairly even representation now of our grinding marks on both of these sides now. Instead of having almost none on this and a whole heap on that, they're very similar. So what I'll do now is, as I continue to spot this, I will now work everything, including the marks on this. So what that will do is now take the whole thing down evenly in relation to these ends, so that when we finish, both of these should finish up at the same time, rather than having this and this completely covered and this only half covered, which means you then have to kind of work it on an angle and start doing the same thing at that point. You know, obviously not taking any off here and trying to work it there, but because we've done it now, from here on in it should be fairly even as we go across there. You can see this isn't exactly a fast process, but it is a good process. It will get this absolutely perfect. As you can already see, it's looking pretty bloody good. And obviously, as we saw at the very start, Our center is our high spot, so it's had the most work done to it. And as I mentioned, there are low spots right on these ends from where the belt sand has been kissing them first and taking it off. But all we have to do is get our angle grinder marks running about an 8mm perimeter around the port, which is the sealing part of the gasket, and we're good to go. Our bolts will take care of the rest, clamping it all on, but as I say, as long as we've got our clamping face, which is only about 6 to 8mm wide around the ports, then we're pretty good to go. But we've still got a bit of work to go before we get it down to that point. So from here on in, you'll just basically see the grinder pattern just start to grow across to the outsides in these areas. So I'll carry on. Like I say, I'll spot the whole lot now, and it's just more of the same, folks, so bear with me. You can see, folks, now at this point it slows down quite significantly because we're no longer taking off big high spots. What we're trying to do is now work our way into a low spot. So to get into these areas, we basically have to take off the entire area piece by piece to just slowly bring the whole thing down, rather than taking off a high to give us coverage on an area. So it's a little bit slow at this point, but you can see that we are slowly creeping across these ports on the end. It's just a matter of just persevering and just sort of keep going. And I know it takes a while to do, but believe me, if you're out in the middle of God knows nowhere, and even if you've got something like a bloody tractor that's got a cast iron exhaust manifold that you had to weld and it's warped, or it's just warped anyway, or even an old car, you got no access to a machine shop, no access to any milling equipment or anything like that, and you have a problem like this that you have to take care of, you may well and truly have the time on your hand to be able to do it, but just not the equipment. So to do this, all you need, as you know, 4-inch angle grinder and something to spot the plate off and the time to do it, and you will get a 100% awesome job. Onward! So you can see here now, folks, we've just gone fully around this end port on this side, and we're not around this guy yet over here. So as we've done before, as I spot up the manifold, I will stop going at this with a grinder until I get around on this side. Once again, just to try and get some sort of a parallelness with these low spots, so that we're not having to take more off one side than the other to get them both down to an even keel kind of thing. So I'll keep spotting it up, but you'll notice when I start back grinding, I won't grind any of this side until this side has gone around the port. And there you have it, folks. We've joined up. We're fully around that port just like we are on this side. I'll clean that off and then we'll go back to spotting the whole thing and just keep going until we get this out a little bit more around that port on both sides. And we're getting pretty friggin' close, guys. Alright folks, we're looking pretty good here now. We've got enough coverage for a gasket around both of these positions here. So what I'm going to do now is change over to a flat wheel and just continue the process. just to refine this surface finish down a bit. It's pretty good. You'd be surprised how flat this actually is as far as surface finish goes. And that will, as I continue to do that, it will further bring this line out. But as it stands now, it is, you know, you would realistically be able to put a gasket on it, and I'm sure it would seal absolutely fine. But with just a little bit more effort, we can get the finish a hell of a lot smoother. So this is just a 40 grit flat wheel I've got on the grinder now, which we'll just continue the process with. Most of the grinding wheel marks have now been replaced by flat wheel marks, and the surface is just a little bit finer. So we know it's flat, and now we're just working on that surface finish. So I'll give it maybe a couple more passes, and then we'll start going up in grits on the flat wheel. Alright folks, I've now swapped out to a 120 grit flat wheel, and we'll go at it with that for a bit. So what I'm doing now folks, I'm going to change direction. So I'm running 90 degrees off the other work I was doing, just to try and flatten out any of the kind of ridge lines that have been created. It's going to be a little bit harder to film this, anyway, that's alright. So yeah, I'm just going off 90 degrees just to kind of help flatten it and try and get rid of any kind of small ridges that I have on there, which there's basically nothing left, but it's, you know, it's all part of the job. I'll carry on. And that is looking pretty bloody good, folks. Pretty damn good indeed. Not sure if you can really see that, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to get a block of something. I have to suss out what I've got here, and with some paper on it, and we'll just go over that by hand now to just get sort of a more even finish. But you can see just how dead flat it is. It is just dead flat. Dead flat, folks. Well, as you'd be aware, it's a mirror reverse of the face of the surface plate. Other than the surface finish, which is not rough at all. It really isn't rough at all. It's basically like it's been milled. So I'll mount this back in here, and we'll start putting some paper over it by hand. So what I've got here, folks, is just a piece of aluminium bar stock, some 180 grit paper. Use a piece of wood if you want. It really doesn't have to be that flat, because we know our surface is flat. All we're trying to do is just get that nice kind of surface finish on there. If we're taking anything out of one area, if it's obvious that we're taking a heap out of one area, we know that we've got a bit of a problem with this, not with this, because this is, as we know, it's perfect. So you can see what we're doing there, folks. It's just highlighting any little layers that we've got from the grinder kissing it, which you can see them quite obviously, but they are very, very tiny when you feel them. It's hard to even get them with your fingernail. I think I might just stitch that paper and go for something a little. I've just swapped out for a little bit of 80. Skinnier though, so I can't grip it on the sides. Anyway. Damn it. So we still have just a few little sort of light sort of nicks. They're very, very light though, folks. Very, very light. Certainly not a concern once you had a gasket on there. Not at all. I'm using a multi-layer steel gasket on these. This is the factory Nissan gasket, and you can see that our sealing area only extends out about 8mm or 6 to 8mm around the outside of the port. So where we're only just around the outside corners in these couple of spots here, it'll be just absolutely fine. There will be no issues sealing those up. So that's pretty much it, folks. I hope you found this video useful and interesting. I'm not sure whether you've ever seen anything done like this before, but as you've seen, it's a very handy technique to know of if you are not in a position where you can get something like this flattened for you by a machine shop. You may not have access to one, it may be too costly, you know, many reasons, or you might just like doing things yourself. You can see this is something that anyone can do. All you need is a handheld grinder, some sort of a flat surface to spot off, a little bit of bearing glue, and mate, you are good to go. And if you go back to the beginning of the video and see what this looked like originally when we first started spotting it, and what it looks like now and how it's progressed, you'll see that this is absolutely super duper flat. So as always, folks, Thanks for stopping by the Aussie Shed. I really hope you like this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheers.